Hey guys, tonight we are going to pull back the curtain on history to look straight into one of the darkest mysteries of the Tudor dynasty, the horrifying death of King Edward VI. For nearly 500 years, the question has lingered. Did this young 15-year-old king die from disease, or was it from a dose of poison cruelly orchestrated? Edward VI was the cherished jewel long awaited by Henry VIII, a boy who was expected to usher in a golden era for England. But his sudden and agonizing death not only ignited a brutal struggle for the crown, but also created a medical mystery that remains unsolved. We will dive into Edward's final days, examining the whispers of conspiracy, the panic at court, and how his death led to a failed coup, turning the young Jane Grey into queen for just 9 days of tragedy. This is the story of a short but turbulent reign, where faith, power, and betrayal collided. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now? I love to know where our community comes from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. End of sex. In October of 1537, after years of anxious longing, King Henry VIII finally welcomed a male heir into the world when Queen Jane Seymour gave birth to Prince Edward. Across England, church bells tolled softly in the morning mist, and great bonfires flickered along the River Thames, their golden glow drifting over thatched rooftops and farmlands alike. Envision King Henry, clad in heavy cloak and riding boots, urging his chestnut charger through moonlit lanes toward Hampton Court, heart pounding with the thrill of triumph at last. In that hushed hour, the Tudor dynasty's future seemed assured, and the realm exhaled in collective relief. Courtiers whispered in candlelit corridors that this child might herald a golden age, washing away decades of religious strife and uncertainty that had shadowed the kingdom since Henry's break with Rome. From the very first dawn of his life, young Edward VI was treated as if he were carved from spun gold. A retinue of royal tutors, doctors, and attendants surrounded his cradle nurses with practiced hands to swaddle him, physicians who measured every breath, and preceptors who planned an education befitting a monarch. Though rumour among commoners spoke of frailty and pale cheeks, those closest observed a different reality. He cooed like any newborn, then grew quickly into a vigorous boy whose limbs stretched ambitiously beneath silk linens. His governess, Mistress Margaret Bryan, noted that he could not be still. He rolled his way across palace carpets, kicked his heels in delight at distant music, and wagged tiny fists in a dance of pure delight. Each cough, each smile, each nap was recorded in meticulous detail by scribes, as though every moment might contain a clue to the realm's destiny. Yet even as celebration swept the land, sorrow crept quietly into the royal nursery. Only a few days after the birth, Queen Jane fell gravely ill, an infection that no prayer or poultice could halt. Her passing left a profound void in both father and son. Henry, stricken with grief he had never known before, withdrew into sombre reflection, while Edward, too young to understand fully, felt an emptiness at his side, where his mother's hand once rested. From that moment, the child's world became a gilded cage, its bars formed not of iron, but of constant vigilance. Palace guards patrolled corridors in pairs, their halberds clinking against marble floors. Nobles took turns at his bedside, their furtive glances revealing half-spoken fears of poison or coup. Even the soft lullabies meant to soothe him were composed with caution, lest any song carry within it a curse. In this environment of lavish care and concealed dread, Edward's earliest days unfolded between silken sheets and whispered counsels. Every morsel placed to his lips was tasted by a servant first, and every visitor, no matter how trusted, was scrutinized for hidden blades or secret sympathies. The palace physicians, armed with leeches and distilled waters, debated theories of humoral balance and divine will, though none could wholly guard against the shadows that lurked beyond the nursery doors. It was in these delicate hours when the world outside stirred with hope, and the candlelight danced across tapestries that the boy prince learned, without words, that his cradle was both cradle and prison, his life bound to the fragile thread of Tudor ambition. Thus began the story of Edward VI, swaddled in splendour, yet wrapped in suspicion, an infant king whose every breath would carry the weight of a kingdom's hopes and the terror of its secrets. In the quiet hush of Hampton Court, amid the echo of bells and the glow of midnight fires, the boy's first chapter was written one of jubilation tempered by grief, of unbridled promise, shadowed by the spectre of peril. As England watched and wondered, the tiny prince slept fitfully, guarded by watchful eyes that saw both saviour and sacrifice in his delicate form. And so, in the soft cradle of history, began the reign of a child destined to shape and be shaped by the turbulent tide of Tudor England. Beginning in his earliest years, Edward VI was raised as his father's divine agent, charged with the solemn duty of purifying the Church of England of all vestiges of Roman Catholic influence. Noble Tudor's scholars versed in classical law and devout Protestant preachers converged upon Hampton Court to shape the boy's mind and spirit. They guided his tiny fingers as he learned to trace the letters of Holy Scripture, taught him to pen graceful petitions as if crafting royal decrees, and opened his eyes to the rich works of ancient Greek philosophers and theologians. Before he had even seen his 8th birthday, Edward sat at polished oak tables, debating the finer points of doctrine with visiting bishops and cardinals, his voice steady and inquisitive. Chroniclers later recorded that his grasp of textual nuance and his capacity for rigorous argument marked him as a prodigy, a child whose intellect shone like a beacon in the dim corridors of Tudor power. Yet beneath the accolades and the embroidered velvet robes lay an ever-present weight of expectation. From the moment he drew his first breath, whispers of hope and conspiracy swirled through the palace halls. England pinned its collective yearning on this fragile prince, believing he could close the wound of religious turmoil wrought by his father's severing of ties with Rome. Every gesture, whether a nod to a visiting dignitary or the slightest hesitation before reciting a psalm, was scrutinized by courtiers hungry for scandal or triumph. A fleeting cough might be whispered as evidence of frailty, a tremor of the hand as portent of weakness. In this atmosphere, young Edward learned swiftly to conceal his doubts, to smooth his features into calm composure, and to speak only when he had measured the weight of each word. The absence of his mother, Queen Jane, compounded his solitude. He lacked the gentle counsel of maternal affection, the soft lullabies that might have eased his restless nights. Instead, Edward found comfort in the stern tutelage of Sir John Cheek and Dr. Richard Cox, who not only instructed him in Latin, rhetoric, and the precedents of monarchy, but also served as surrogate guardians of his conscience. They extolled the virtues of self-discipline and piety, urging him to steel his heart against the trappings of childhood pleasure. As dawn's first light pierced the stained-glass windows of Westminster Hall, the boy prince was already seated at a long table of gilt chairs, poring over Greek manuscripts while his contemporaries still clutched ragged dolls and chased chickens in the courtyard. In the glow of torchlight and candle flame, Edward participated in the formal ceremonies that punctuated court life. He learned to curtsy with princely grace before ambassadors bearing gifts of exotic silks and porcelain, to offer solemn blessings at the altar during High Mass conducted in English, and to receive the oaths of loyalty from trembling knights who knelt before his miniature throne. Common folk were sometimes admitted to glimpse the future monarch, pressing through the grand gates to catch a glimpse of a small figure swathed in scarlet velvet and crowned with a silver circlet. To them he was at once a symbol of unity and a portent of triumphant renewal, a boy whose serene countenance conveyed both innocence and the weight of destiny. By his 7th autumn, Edward had mastered not only the art of governance in theory, but also the performance of regal dignity in practice. That autumn, he delivered a brief address to visiting envoys, articulating England's commitment to the pure word of God, with a solemnity that belied his tender years. The court applauded politely, yet behind closed doors, advisers traded anxious glances. Could so young a mind bear the turbulent storms of politics and faith without faltering? The question hovered in every corner of the palace, a silent admonition that Edward's path would be lined with both reverence and peril. Thus, the prince's childhood unfolded like a tapestry woven from threads of knowledge, ceremony, and silent vigil. In the hush of his private chambers, he memorized passages from Street, Augustine. In the clatter of the great hall, he stood unwavering as peers and prelates bowed low. His life was one of duality, privileged yet constrained, celebrated yet watched, and it taught him early the art of concealment, to cloak uncertainty behind a composed facade, to temper youthful enthusiasm with sober reflection. In these formative years, Edward learned that the crown he wore in miniature was more than ornament. It was a mantle of responsibility that would one day rest upon his shoulders in full weight, demanding of him both devotion and resolve beyond his tender age. The death of Queen Jane Seymour cast King Henry VIII into a deep and unending sorrow. In the weeks that followed, his once boisterous court fell silent under the weight of mourning. Tapestries hung darker, and even the grand feasts were served in near-hushed tones. Yet grief alone did not quell Henry's anxieties. He ordered layer upon layer of security measures to shield his beloved son, Prince Edward VI, from any harm. Each meal was rigorously examined by royal physicians. Platters of roasted venison and bowls of pottage were tested for toxins before even a single bite reached the prince's lips. Servants who carried trays were themselves scrutinized, their clothes inspected for hidden blades, hands washed and inspected for wounds. No one, a page, a maid, nor a knight, was permitted to draw near without first passing a medical examination. In this gilded cage, the prince was safe, yes, but also utterly constrained. As days unfolded into months, a shadow of suspicion settled over Hampton Court. Whispers of poisoning drifted through candlelit corridors like a noxious perfume. Some attendants, uncertain whether to believe the rumours or to shield themselves from them, approached Edward with offerings of fruit and flowers, convinced that gifts of innocence might stave off plots against his life. Others, driven by darker curiosity or opportunism, spied on fellow attendants hearing the slightest cough, questioning every bruise, and reported their findings in hushed tones to the king's counsellors. This perpetual tension seeped into the prince's young mind. He came to understand, even before his 10th birthday, that power was inseparable from peril, and that every smile might conceal a dagger. Amid this climate of vigilance, Henry VIII intensified his son's education with an almost militant zeal. From dawn until the hour before supper time, Edward studied the scriptures, memorizing psalms and parables until their cadence was etched into his memory. He was required to commit his father's will to heart as well, learning each clause of succession and every nuance of the settlement that would guide the realm when Henry himself was gone. Tutors drilled him in the art of leadership, the correct tone for issuing a decree, the weight of silence that must follow a royal command, and the patience to allow advisers to speak before rendering judgment. Playtime, when it existed at all, was brief and scheduled. The rudimentary games of childhood yielded quickly to the sober rituals of governance. Under such exacting tutelage, Edward's spirit matured with unnerving rapidity. His laughter, once free and unguarded, grew rarer. His eyes, bright and curious, took on a careful watchfulness. He observed the machinations of courtiers, how a slight bow could curry favour, how a whispered word in the privy chamber could topple a rival. Even at his tender age, he recognized that alliances were forged and broken on the shifting sands of ambition. In one private lesson, he reportedly paused mid-recitation of Street, Paul's epistles, to remark quietly, "A kingdom without justice is like a body without a soul," leaving his tutor astonished at both his grasp of morality and the gravity with which he spoke. Yet despite the burden of expectation and the constant vigilance that marked his days, Edward remained, in fleeting moments, a boy of keen observation and gentle introspection. In the solitude of his bedside chamber, he would trace the delicate patterns of light and shadow cast by the tall, mullioned windows, pondering the contrast between freedom and constraint. He wrote short verses in Latin praising humility and charity, words that seemed at odds with the steel in his voice when matters of state arose. His dreams, as described in rare letters to confidants, were filled with images of open fields and clear springs, a stark counterpoint to the stone walls and guarded halls that defined his waking hours. In this crucible of loss and doubt, the boy prince's character was forged. The gilded cage that sheltered him also tempered him. It taught him that mercy was a choice, that wisdom required patience, and that courage meant standing firm even when the world closed in. Though he did not yet fully comprehend the magnitude of the throne he would one day occupy, Edward VI was already comporting himself with a solemnity far beyond his years. He learned that the love of a father could become a fortress as daunting as any enemy, and that to wear the crown in miniature or in truth demanded a heart both resolute and restrained. Thus did the prince's early years unfold. Beneath the heavy velvet draperies of Hampton Court, in the hush of midnight vigils and the steady glow of lanterns, Edward's mind and spirit were shaped by sorrow, suspicion, and an unrelenting drive for purity. As the bells tolled each hour and the physicians watched his breath, he prepared in silence for a destiny neither he nor the realm could yet imagine. And in those hushed moments, between study and ceremony, a young sovereign in waiting learned the most enduring lesson of all, that to rule requires not only power, but the wisdom to wield it with grace. In the pale light of a winter morning in January of 1547, the realm of England stood hushed as word spread that King Henry VIII had drawn his final breath. In that moment, 9-year-old Edward, his ever-watchful nurses still swathed in wick-dark gowns, became Edward VI, sovereign of a nation both weary and hopeful. Across villages and market towns, villagers halted their labours and bowed heads in prayer, for they believed that in this fragile boy lay the promise of a new season of peace, an era unmarked by the religious storms that had rent the kingdom's conscience in twain. Yet behind the hushed hymns and tolling bells there lay the careful whisper of Henry's will. A regent council of noble lords and prelates, entrusted with guiding the young king until he reached maturity. In theory, Edward was crowned ruler of England. In practice, the reins of governance passed into the hands of those appointed by his ailing father. The coronation ceremony itself unfolded beneath the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey, where sunlight filtered through stained glass windows in muted pools of ruby and sapphire. Archbishops and bishops, garbed not in the full trappings of Rome, but in the simplified vestments decreed by Henry's final reforms, processed in solemn procession. The crown, forged in glittering gold and set with gemstones, was placed upon the boy's head, with gentle deliberation, its weight tiny upon his brow, yet portentous of responsibilities far greater than those of any child. The congregation erupted in murmured acclamations. "Long live the King!" their voices blending into a single lilting refrain that drifted through the nave like a prayer for deliverance. The liturgies, blessings, psalter readings, and the chanting of ancient prayers translated into their mother tongue adhered precisely to the rubric Henry VIII had penned in his last days, an attempt to assure a seamless transition from father to son, from one era to the next. Yet even as trumpets heralded the new reign and banners fluttered in the winter wind, the truth lingered in the corridors. Authority had quietly slipped from the child, king's grip. The regent council, comprised of high-born nobles and trusted advisers, assumed the tasks of governance with keen eyes on their own ambitions. In the privacy of candlelit chambers, these lords debated policies not only for the realm's welfare but also for their personal legacies. They weighed questions of taxation, military campaigns, and foreign alliances, each meeting a delicate dance of courtesy and covert manoeuvring. The very documents that proclaimed Edward VI as ruler now bore the signatures of these councillors, their seals pressed beside the tiny royal cipher, as though the boy's name were but a gentle whisper beside the fervent declarations of power. Outside, the streets of London thrummed with anticipation and unease. Merchants gazed skyward at pennants emblazoned with the Tudor rose, while watchmen lingered at street corners beneath torches that sputtered in the chill. Town criers proclaimed new edicts, their words echoing off cobblestones. And yet the people discerned a subtle shift. Though the boy wore the crown, it was the voices of these regent lords that commanded the realm's pulse. Churches nodded in respectful acceptance, their congregations torn between reverence for the youthful monarch and silent prayers that the council would not betray Henry's final wishes. Within the palace walls, Edward's days settled into a delicate rhythm of ceremony and solitude. He observed the council's discussions through grated windows of the Privy Council chamber, his small frame pressed against the wood, as though straining to grasp every word. Tutors continued their lessons, Latin, theology, matters of state, yet now their instruction was interwoven with the council's pronouncements, preparing him, ever so gently, for the day he would finally claim true authority. In his chambers, tapestries depicting his father's triumphs hung silent testimony to a legacy he had inherited but not yet experienced. Guards paced outside his door with long halberds, their breaths misting in the corridor as they conferred in low tones about grain shortages or uprisings in remote shires. As winter deepened, The Regent Council held its first public session in the Painted Chamber, ink-blotted records trailing behind each lord's steps. They passed laws to stabilise coinage, levied modest taxes to rebuild castles battered by border skirmishes, and sent envoys to negotiate treaties with French and Scottish courts. All decisions bore the Crown's name and the boy king's blessing. Yet it was the Council's hand that guided the pen. It was in these encounters that England's governance took on new forms, shaped by the interplay between youthful idealism and seasoned caution, between the desire for continuity and the hunger for influence. Thus, the stage was set for a turbulent chapter in Tudor history. The accession of Edward VI, though solemnly declared in the hushed splendour of Westminster, had in truth inaugurated a contest of wills. On one side stood the innocent monarch, cloaked in the awe of divine right and tender age. On the other, a cadre of noble councillors, each eager to steer the nation according to both Henry's legacy and their own designs. And so, beneath the motionless gaze of royal portraits and the flicker of candlelight in draughty chambers, England embarked on its next journey, one in which the crown rested lightly upon a child's head, while the real weight of rule lay heavy in the hands of the Regent Council. Within days of his accession, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset brother to the late Queen Jane, asserted his authority as Lord Protector with a quiet but resolute ambition. Somerset stood before the Privy Council amid the hush of early morning candlelight, proposing sweeping changes for the benefit of the Most High King. He marshalled forces to quell the simmering unrest in Cornwall, where farmers and weavers had taken up pitchforks in the summer of 1549 to protest rising rents and religious innovations. The Protector's troops, brass-helmed pikemen and steel-capped volunteers, marched into market towns under banners bearing Edward's youthful cipher. Their arrival crushed the rebellion swiftly and decisively, sending a clear message throughout the realm. The new regime would brook no insurrection. In tandem with his military ventures, Somerset championed the spiritual reformation that had animated Edward's own convictions. Alongside Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, he orchestrated the removal of the Blessed Sacrament from altars, replacing Latin rites with English prayers that echoed in hallowed aisles and parish churches alike. Parishioners, once murmuring Latin responses under their breath, now read aloud from common prayer books in their native tongue. Effigies of saints and carved rood crosses were stripped from sanctuaries, their wooden fragments consigned to bonfires that crackled beneath grey skies. Though Edward was barely 9 years old, he lent his full assent to these measures, his small hand pressing the royal seal upon edicts that declared England's churches purged of idolatry. The chronicles of the age record that the boy prince's eyes shone with zeal as he affirmed the mission to purify the national faith, viewing each ceremony as a solemn duty bestowed by divine ordinance. Yet behind the public spectacle of reform and repression, the corridors of power hummed with rivalry. Somerset's rapid accumulation of influence unsettled other noble houses, who saw in his protectorate both the promise of progress and the threat of domination. The treasury groaned under the weight of military campaigns and the expense of rebuilding churches in the new Protestant style. Grain prices climbed sharply as war coffers emptied, forcing common labourers to pay more for their daily bread. Disquiet turned to discontent when harvests failed on the western marches, and peasants whispered a refrain as old as tyranny itself: the burdens of reform must not fall so heavily upon the poor. Amid this unrest, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, surveyed the political landscape with keen eyes. Warwick, son of a former protector, recognised Somerset's vulnerability and began forging alliances with sceptical bishops and disaffected magnates. He offered counsel at Wolsey's old table in Greenwich Palace, commiserating over shared concerns. Too many soldiers drained the coffers, too many sermons drained the spirit of compromise. Warwick's voice, measured and persuasive, carried weight among the council. He urged restraint, proposing that the pace of change be moderated lest the very fabric of society unravel. Behind closed doors, he and his confidants plotted subtle intrigues. A favour here, a rumour there, each designed to chip away at Somerset's standing. Somerset, for his part, remained steadfast in his conviction that reform and order were two sides of the same coin. He tightened his grip on patronage, distributing offices and lands to loyal retainers, thereby reinforcing his network of supporters. Elizabethan chroniclers later noted his confident bearing in the Painted Chamber, where he donned a velvet cloak trimmed with ermine, holding court like a regent in all but name. He convened sessions of the council with the boy king in attendance, ensuring that Edward's presence lent legitimacy to every decree. Nevertheless, those who watched from the shadows whispered that Somerset's ambition had begun to eclipse his duty, that his protectorate was morphing into a dynastic project clothed in the rhetoric of piety. By the winter of 1550, the friction between Somerset and Warwick had become impossible to conceal. Council meetings, once polite and deferential, grew fractious as Warwick accused Somerset of fiscal profligacy and administrative neglect. Somerset, in turn, defended his actions as necessary measures to secure the realm against sedition and superstition. Each rebuttal sharpened the divide, drawing more lords into the competing camps. As frost settled on the palace grounds, a darker frost settled within the council chambers, the warning that even the purest intentions could be tainted by the lust for power. Thus did the stage set by Edward Seymour's bold protectorate give way to the slow burn of a power struggle. The banner of reform, which had fluttered bright and hopeful over England's villages and cathedrals, now bore the rumpled edges of controversy. The memory of Cornwall's rebellion, and of fires kindled in both hearth and pulpit, lingered like a cautionary tale, that noble aims may falter when weighed down by the cost of their own ambition. And so, in the quiet glow of candle flames, the council prepared for the next act in a drama of crowns and consciences, an uneasy interlude before the boy king would one day step fully into his own. In the hazy dawn of 1549, as mist curled over the rooftops of London and the church bells tolled a cautious refrain, a new power quietly shifted behind the heavy oak doors of the Privy Council. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, soon to be known as Duke of Northumberland, saw in the kingdom's discontent a chance to reshape its future. The peasantry writhed under the burden of soaring grain prices, and cartoons of unrest flickered in the provinces, while the tide of military failure lapped at England's borders. With a discreet hand and a network of sympathetic nobles at his back, Warwick orchestrated a soft coup that would unseat Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, from the mantle of Lord Protector. Under a veil of ceremony and feigned deference, Warwick assembled a council meeting in the Painted Chamber, its walls echoing with the faint clink of armour and the low murmur of beckoning voices. Somerset, attended by his loyal retainers, entered expecting routine council. Warwick and his allies, seated at the head table, stood and offered curt bows. Before Somerset could protest, trumpets sounded, and armed guards, veterans of the Cornish campaign, blocked the exits. The Duke's fate was sealed by gentle but inexorable pressure. "By the command of the King," announced Warwick, his voice even, "we request your resignation as Lord Protector, that peace and order might once more prevail." With few options and little appetite for civil strife, Somerset bowed his head and relinquished the seal of office to the new protector. In the eyes of the public, this transfer of authority was framed as a seamless act of loyalty to Edward VI. Proclamations draped across market squares read, "His Majesty, though scarce 13 years of age, does now oversee the governance of this realm, invoking pity and pride in equal measure." Each official document bore the line, "By His Majesty's gracious command," lending the boy king's name a weight it had seldom wielded. Yet behind the ornate crimson tapestries and ceremonial robes, it was Warwick, now Duke of Northumberland, who set the strategic course. With deft precision, he drafted military orders to secure the Scottish marches, devised a modest tax to replenish depleted coffers, and issued a fresh edict mandating the removal of remaining Catholic imagery from parish churches. To solidify his influence and secure the line of succession, Northumberland pressed for revisions to the royal inheritance. He advanced the name of Lady Jane Grey, his son's young wife, and a devoted Protestant into the list of rightful heirs, weaving her into the tapestry of Tudor continuity. The amendment, proclaimed with solemn ceremony in the council chamber, suggested that should the boy king perish without issue, Jane's claim would stand unchallenged by his half-sisters. This manoeuvre, cloaked in legal precision, spoke volumes of Northumberland's intent to forge a bond of loyalty between the crown and his own ambitions, all while maintaining the veneer of deference to royal prerogative. Amid these high-stakes gambits, Edward VI observed with keen interest. Though nominally confined to the sidelines of power, he seized every opportunity to speak his mind. At times, he displayed the stubborn resolve of a seasoned monarch. He urged the council to accelerate the Protestant reforms, demanding full abolition of the mass and the sale of monasteries' lands, to fund poor relief. Letters penned in his small hand, preserved by later archivists, recount the prince's desire to punish recalcitrant cardinals who resisted the new ecclesiastical order, and to grant estates to zealous pastors who had championed the cause of reformation. His directives, though couched in polite deference, bore the force of sovereign will, prompting both admiration and caution among his advisers. Northumberland, for his part, walked a narrow path between harnessing the king's fervour and tempering his youthful zeal. He recognised that Edward's unbridled devotion to Protestant ideals could galvanise popular support, giving moral authority to every edict, and yet he feared that too rapid an onslaught might fracture the fragile alliance between reformers and moderates. In council sessions lit by lantern glow, the Duke weighed these considerations. He would bolster the boy king's image as a devout leader, yet insulate him from the perils of unchecked fanatical zeal. He guided Edward's speeches, suggesting which passages of scripture might best sway the House of Commons and which actions might provoke backlash in the shires. This delicate dance of power played out in the ornate chambers of Whitehall and behind velvet curtains in the audience chamber. Northumberland's men distributed pamphlets praising the young sovereign's piety, while suppressing murmurs of discontent among landed gentry wary of social upheaval. Edward, though only 12 turning 13, absorbed these lessons in statecraft, when to assert his royal voice, and when to allow the Duke's more seasoned tongue to speak in his name. It was a formative period, in which the boy king learned that the crown he wore was both a gift and a burden, that the authority he exercised was inextricably linked to the fortunes of those who held his hand. Thus, the winter of 1551 approached with England perched on a knife's edge. Under the puppet tableau of the king in Westminster Hall, Northumberland directed the realm's affairs from council tables and battle plans. Yet the strings he held were ever taut, for the spectre of rebellion and the rumble of economic distress persisted. In the soft glow of candlelight, the young Edward watched and learned, his small silhouette a reminder that one day he might stand alone, wielding the power he now shared with his protector. And so, as the hush of winter deepened across the land, England's future lay in the careful balance between youthful conviction and noble ambition, a balance that would shape the kingdom's fate for years to come. In the years 1552 to 1553, the private journals of Edward VI unveil a startling transformation. The once gentle boy prince had become a ruler of steely resolve. When Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, his early protector and uncle, stood accused of high treason, the young king did not hesitate. Summoning the council at dawn, Edward issued the sentence with an icy composure that belied his tender age. The Duke of Somerset was beheaded upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock this very morning. He recorded tersely in his hand, each word etched without a trace of sorrow or hesitation. The stark brevity of that entry sent a chill through the nobility. They realized that beneath the trappings of childhood lay a heart as unyielding as any seasoned sovereign's. This ruthless display of authority marked the beginning of Edward's deliberate effort to assert his true role. No longer content to serve as a mere figurehead, he invited members of Parliament and leading councillors into the Painted Chamber to debate the realm's future. Wool merchants and ship captains, bishops and barons, each was granted audience with the youthful king, seated beneath the tapestries that bore his father's triumphs. Edward listened to their petitions, his gaze steady, before outlining a bold agenda. He placed the reform of feudal taxation at the top of his priorities, determined that noble estates should contribute more equitably to the royal coffers. Next, he called for the restoration and expansion of the kingdom's granaries, that no subject might go hungry in lean years. Finally, he urged the establishment of a network of Protestant schools, envisioning an educated populace grounded in the principles of the Reformation. The tone of these sessions was marked by an austere seriousness that both impressed and unnerved those present. When a baron hesitated to yield more land revenues, Edward fixed him with a calm but firm stare, reminding him that a kingdom is built upon justice, not solely upon lineage. When a bishop questioned the haste of his plans, the young king replied that delay is a privilege of the affluent, the poor cannot wait. Such utterances, delivered in a voice still tinged with the inflections of youth, carried the weight of command. Whispered rumours began to circulate. Would this boy, king barely 14 years old, grow into a benevolent monarch, or would his sternness become the hallmark of a despot? Yet even as Edward imposed these rigorous measures, his actions were driven by an unshakable faith. He frequently convened communal prayers within the royal apartments, gathering his councillors around a simple wooden table strewn with prayer books and candle wax. There, beneath the watchful eyes of carved angels on the oak panelling, he led readings from the epistles and engaged in fervent debate over the meaning of grace and salvation. No compromise with papist traditions would be tolerated. Altars were stripped bare of icons, and vestments of scarlet and ermine gave way to the plain, black and white of Puritan simplicity. Chronicles of the era refer to him as the iron-hearted youth, one who would rather forgo the genteel ceremonies of old than dilute the purity of England's reformed faith. Within the hush of these devotional gatherings, Edward spoke with a conviction that transcended his years. He argued that a true king must not only pass laws, but also embody the virtue he sought to instill. When a skeptical noble suggested tempering the reforms to placate conservative critics, Edward responded that a ruler's duty is not to please the fickle many, but to uphold the steadfast truth. His clear-eyed determination inspired some councillors to redouble their efforts on behalf of the Protestant cause, while others whispered anxiously that his zeal might alienate too many subjects. By late spring of 1553, the kingdom bore the imprint of Edward's will. Feudal levies had been recalibrated, granaries restocked, and dozens of grammar schools established in market towns from Kent to Cornwall. Yet for all these achievements, the boy king's court was hushed by the memory of Somerset's fate. Courtiers walked with measured steps, wary of incurring his young majesty's displeasure. Even the grand feasts at Whitehall were subdued, with pewter plates replacing the silver and game birds served without elaborate sauces. Edward was often seen at the head of the table, his slender frame cloaked in sober black, reading quietly from a folio of psalms while attending physicians whispered prognoses in his ear. And still he pressed onward. When news reached him of unrest in rural shires, peasants clashing over tithes or magistrates reluctant to enforce the new statutes, Edward dispatched commissioners with explicit instructions: quell discord with both firmness and mercy, but do not hesitate to employ the full force of the king's authority. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, he noted in a letter to the Lord Chancellor, and it is better that a few feel the sting of justice than that all suffer the rot of anarchy. End of 4. Thus, the young Edward V, though scarcely into his teens, had carved a reputation as a sovereign who would brook no half measures. His journal entries, spare and unadorned, reveal a prince at once ruthless in action and devout in spirit. In the flicker of torchlight and the hush of midnight vigils, he forged his image as the iron-clad youth, a ruler defined by unwavering conviction and marked for either triumph or tragedy. And as England watched with bated breath, the realm wondered which path this singular boy-king would ultimately tread, one of resolute reform or one of stern despotism. In the early dawn of 1553, a chill wind swept through the corridors of Whitehall, and the court watchman noted with concern that King Edward VI, now 15 years of age, had fallen prey to a grievous malady. At first, his symptoms seemed no different from the common cold: a persistent cough and a fever that flickered like a dying candle. Physicians of the Tudor court, skilled in the arts of bloodletting and herbal poultices, observed the young king carefully, recalling how he had once triumphed over smallpox and measles in seasons past. Yet, by the end of the second week, Edward's condition spiraled beyond their hopes. He began to cough scarlet-tinged sputum, and his limbs swelled like overripe fruit. His once rosy complexion turned a sallow grey, as if the very life had seeped from his veins. Anxiety crept into every chamber of the palace, as attendants watched the sovereign's rasping breath and whispered fearful wonders. Had some hidden poison been slipped into his cup? Rumours slithered through Westminster's vaulted passages like a restless spirit. "They seek to kill our king," courtiers murmured behind mitred bishops and armoured sentinels. Even the imperial ambassador penned urgent missives to his master, reporting that talk of foul play had begun the very day Edward's fever first flared. In the midst of this mounting dread, a mysterious woman, cloaked in velvet the colour of midnight, appeared at the palace gates. Claiming the wisdom of distant apothecaries, she offered a royal elixir, a tincture she swore would purge the poison and restore the king's health. Desperation outweighed prudence. The Regent Council, moved by hope, granted her permission to administer her concoction. The court watched with bated breath as Edward's fragile hand accepted the vial, only to see his condition worsen by candle's light. His limbs swelled further, His skin rose in angry sores, and the stranger vanished as silently as she had come, leaving behind only questions and a palpable dread. Was this a benevolent fraud or a calculated act of betrayal? In the days that followed, the treatment of the boy king became an unsettling melange of Tudor medicine and superstition. Physicians dripped leeches upon his wrists, drained foul humours from his arm, and prescribed bitter draughts of wormwood and mugwort. Monks chanted prayers in a neighbouring chapel, their voices rising and falling in solemn lament, while astrologers scrawled cryptic charts under flickering torches. Official dispatches to the provinces spoke of signs of improvement, yet the people of London saw shuttered windows and heart-rending strains of mournful trumpets at dusk. Servants in the inner court exchanged furtive glances. Nobles braved the risk of contagion to glimpse the king's chamber, claiming they sought only to confirm the truth of his condition. In that hush of guarded urgency, the palace gates were barred, and every visitor was subjected to strict examination both for wounds and for whispered loyalties. As pangs of uncertainty gnawed at the realm, Edward lay upon his bed of eiderdown, his breath shallow and ragged. At times he roused, his eyes reflecting the violet glow of evening lamps, and whispered prayers for mercy. He clutched the rosary beads gifted by Archbishop Cranmer, murmuring psalms between coughing fits. Courtiers hovered at the bedside, their faces drawn tight with apprehension, offering sips of barley broth and soothing words. Yet each promise of relief proved fleeting, as though the king's vitality had slipped through their fingers like grains of fine sand. Meanwhile, Northumberland and the council faced a growing tide of whispers that spoke of treason. Some claimed the mysterious healer had been an agent of rival nobles. Others suspected foreign agents seeking to disrupt England's fragile Reformation. Every creak in the corridor, every hushed conversation beyond the locked doors, fueled the sense that the palace itself had become a crucible of mistrust. Guards, once discreetly posted, became omnipresent sentinels. Every carriage arriving at the gate was searched, every cloak examined for hidden vials. Through windows misted by winter breath, the people of London glimpsed the shadowy silhouette of the palace, its towers looming against the grey sky like silent witnesses to the unfolding tragedy. They heard nightly the solemn curfew horn, announcing that no commoner might approach the royal precincts. Shopkeepers shuttered their stalls at dusk, and mothers hushed their children with stories of the beloved prince who lay fighting an unseen foe. In taverns, hushed prayers offered comfort, and in parish churches, the faithful knelt before simple wooden crosses, entreating divine favour for their boy monarch. Thus did England hold its breath in the spring of 1553, caught between hope and despair. In that fragile interlude, the fate of a kingdom hinged on the frail pulse of a young king whose every breath was a precious gift, and every cough a grim reminder of his mortality. And as dawn gave way to dusk, the world watched and waited, knowing that in the quiet darkness of a king's chamber, history itself teetered on the edge of an uncertain dawn. In the gentle blush of spring, as April of 1553 unfolded across England, a fragile hope stirred within the stone walls of Whitehall. To the astonishment of both courtiers and common folk, Edward VI, now 15 years of age, showed sudden signs of recovery. His cough, once ragged and relentless, eased into a soft rasp, and his fever, which had scorched his cheeks a fortnight prior, cooled to a pale glow. On days when the sun broke through pearly clouds, the court physicians approved brief excursions into the royal gardens. There, Edward, gaunt but resolute, was propped into a crimson sedan chair and borne along gravel paths lined with budding roses. He breathed in the spring air, his thin shoulders rising and falling with each deliberate respiration, while a silent retinue of attendants kept vigilant watch. On occasion, he opted for a short stroll, supported by a handmaid and a loyal page, pausing beneath blossoming magnolias to steady himself. These fleeting outings were captured in hastily commissioned portraits. A slender figure draped in black velvet, eyes still bright with youthful conviction, a faint smile playing upon his lips. Such images, circulated throughout the realm, carried with them a balm of reassurance, dispelling rumours that Edward had already joined his royal ancestors. The Regent Council, eager to spread comfort, released proclamations praising the boy's excellent progress. Town criers delivered the news to hushed marketplaces. His Majesty rallies in health. Trumpets blared from the Tower of London, and the press printed paeans to Edward's indomitable spirit. Sermons in parish churches spoke of divine favour, crediting the king's resurgence to celestial intercession. In every corner of the kingdom, hopeful prayers were offered for his full restoration, and merchants provided fresh blooms to adorn the palace chapels. This renaissance of optimism lifted whispers of impending tragedy, replacing dread with cautious celebration. Perhaps, they thought, the iron-hearted youth would yet steer England toward tranquility. Yet, as swiftly as this renewal arrived, it began to unravel. Only weeks later, Edward succumbed to a violent relapse. His cough returned with ferocity, now accompanied by a dreadful expectoration of greenish-black pus that spoke of corruption within his lungs. The swelling in his arms and legs grew grotesque, flesh ballooning like overripe fruit. His skin took on a sallow, bruised hue, and open sores festered upon his limbs. Witnesses recoiled as tufts of hair loosened, falling in clumps upon his pillow, and his nails detached in small segments, revealing the raw tenderness beneath. The court physicians, once buoyed by signs of improvement, now conferred in alarmed undertones, their charts crowded with notes of growing infection. The palace corridors, which had echoed with relief, fell once more into a hush of apprehension. In response to this dire turn, the Regent Council convened an emergency session within the candle-lit Privy Chamber. Lords and bishops gathered beneath the painted ceiling while hushed prayers rose like incense to the rafters. They ordered a solemn service in the Chapel Royal, where choirs intoned pleas for mercy and the scent of sandalwood and frankincense drifted through arched doorways. Yet neither hymn nor holy smoke could staunch the tide of Edward's suffering. Day by day his strength waned. He lay whisper-thin upon his pallet, eyes half-lidded as though peering into distant shadows. Each convulsive cough echoed through the bedchamber, a stark reminder that his life hung by a slender thread. Within the palace, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Duke Northumberland, who still bore the title of Lord Protector, showed the first cracks of unease. His once steady composure faltered during council meetings, where he cast anxious glances toward the sealed doors of the royal apartments. Advisers murmured behind bated lips, "If His Majesty shall pass from us, who then shall wear the crown?" This question, spoken in frightened whispers, betrayed the fragility of power itself. Outside the inner sanctum, gentlemen in waiting patrolled the corridors more frequently, their armour glinting in torchlight as they scanned faces for signs of conspiracy or cowardice. The fleeting revival of Edward VI now seemed akin to a tender green bud caught in a gale, its promise dashed before it could fully bloom. Hope, once radiant, had collapsed into fresh despair, leaving courtiers to ponder the perils of ambition and mortality. Portraits that once mounted triumphant gazes were quietly removed from galleries. Public proclamations that celebrated recovery lay unclaimed, gathering dust upon pedestal and desk. Even the Chapel Royal's tapestries, which had gleamed with scenes of redemption, were shrouded in sombre velvet. In these sombre days of April 1553, the kingdom stood vigil over its boy sovereign, caught between prayer and dread, yearning for a miracle that seemed to slip ever further from grasp. On the 21st day of May in the year 1553, as summer's amber light filtered through the narrow casement windows of his bedchamber, King Edward VI summoned every ounce of his fading strength for one final, fateful act. Though agony tore through his chest with each breath, and his limbs trembled beneath the weight of relentless fever, he would not let his suffering extinguish the flame of the Reformation he had championed since childhood. He knew with chilling clarity that should his half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ascend the throne, the hard-won gains of Protestant England would be swept away, and the nation would once more bow before the foreign power of Rome. Determined to safeguard his spiritual legacy, Edward dispatched for his most trusted legal advisers to gather at his bedside. Those summoned serious-eyed clerks of the Great Seal, esteemed canon lawyers, and the Lord Chancellor himself entered the chamber with reverence tinged by dread. The air was heavy with the scent of burning frankincense, mingled with the faint tang of medicine still clinging to Edward's blankets. Candlelight danced upon the walls, illuminating the gold embroidery of the young king's night robes. Edward lay propped upon a canopy bed, his once rosy cheeks now sunk and pale, but his gaze still sharp and commanding. With a voice that, though faint, carried unmistakable resolve, he addressed the assembled council. "I will not suffer the crown to pass to one who adheres to papal superstition. The realm's pure faith must endure beyond my mortal breath. For hours, the chamber resounded with the soft scratching of quills as the advisers committed Edward's directives to vellum. Each clause was weighted with solemnity. Let not the succession fall to Mary, whose faith is contrary to the true word of God. By my royal hand, I appoint Lady Jane Grey, my beloved cousin and daughter-in-law of the Duke of Northumberland, as heir to this crown. The young monarch insisted that the document reflect not only his legal authority, but his most fervent convictions. He paused frequently to gather strength, murmuring brief prayers to the Almighty for guidance, his lips moving in silent petition, even as he guided the wording of each sentence. His advisers, torn between awe and sorrow, dared not challenge a word, witnessing the ironclad will of a prince on the brink of eternity. When at last the final phrase was inscribed, Edward dipped his trembling fingers into the crimson seal ink. With a steady hand, he pressed his signet ring bearing the Tudor rose onto the parchment. The seal left a vivid imprint, glistening in the glow of taper and torch. A hush fell upon the room as the king's signature was absorbed into the document's fibre, an indelible testament to his last command. "So let it be written," he breathed, "and so let it stand." Even in his weakened state, his voice carried the certainty of divine mandate. Witnesses then stepped forward to attest the will, each placing their own seal and signature alongside the royal cipher. They spoke brief affirmations, their voices thick with emotion. By His Majesty's express desire and faithful counsel. Under the weight of his last breath, this devise for the succession is enacted. Through murmurs of "God save Her Majesty" and solemn nods, the council sealed Edward's wishes into law. The very room, lined with the rich tapestries of past Tudor triumphs, seemed to hold its breath as the gravity of the moment settled upon all present. This extraordinary intervention, wrought from a bed of agony, irrevocably altered England's course. No longer bound by the Act of Succession proclaimed by Henry VIII, the realm stood poised to recognise a new sovereign, Lady Jane Grey, a devout Protestant whose claim rested on Edward's final will. Behind the scenes, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward's protector, and Jane's father-in-law, moved with swift purpose to proclaim the devise throughout the kingdom. Messengers rode into the night, bearing copies of the testament to every county town. Town criers declared in market squares that Lady Jane Grey is now Queen of England, her name echoing off timbered halls and through silent hamlets alike. For many nobles and commoners, the news was met with confusion and trepidation. Mary and Elizabeth, once enshrined as rightful heirs, were now bypassed by the word of a dying king. Some whispered anxieties of civil war, yet others still buoyed by Edward's name, and his unwavering faith welcomed the shift as the final bulwark against papal encroachment. In the grand hall of Whitehall, banners bearing Jane's heraldry were unfurled alongside the armed guard of Northumberland's loyal regiment, a display of both ceremony and coercion. Thus, as Edward VI slipped quietly from this life a fortnight later, the stage was fully set for a fierce contest of crowns. The boy king's last breath had carved a path for his chosen successor, and in doing so, ignited a storm of loyalties and conflicts that would soon engulf the realm. Lady Jane Grey, anointed in haste and bound by her cousin's dying will, became the fulcrum upon which England's fate would pivot. And all the while, the echoes of Edward's resolute voice, uttered between prayers and pen strokes, lingered in candlelit chambers. Let the pure faith endure, for England's salvation depends upon it. No sooner had the life slipped from King Edward VI than the Duke of Northumberland sprang into action, orchestrating the swift transfer of royal authority to his chosen heir, Lady Jane Grey. In the days immediately following the late king's passing, the devise for the succession, signed in Edward's own hand, was carefully copied onto vellum and pressed with the royal seal in multiple government offices: the Chancery, the Exchequer, and the Court of Wards. Each parchment, bearing the Tudor rose and the jaunty script of the boy king, served as incontrovertible evidence that the crown should bypass Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth in favour of Jane, the king's beloved cousin. Meanwhile, under cover of dusk and the hush of midnight orders, Northumberland dispatched detachments of loyal troops to strategic vantage points encircling London: the gates of Aldgate, the heights of Southwark, and the fringes of Westminster Bridge. Soldiers in steel breastplates and bearskin cloaks took up positions at these choke points, their long spears gleaming dully in lantern light, prepared to intercept any messenger or militia sympathetic to Mary Tudor or Elizabeth. Within the palace precincts, Princess Mary was watched with a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. Courtiers, once her companions at the high table, now hovered as silent sentinels outside her chamber door. Any gentleman found attempting to deliver message cords or private letters to the princess was detained and questioned under oath. No visitor, cleric, or courtier was permitted unfettered audience. All were required to swear fealty to the new succession or face charges of treason. Yet Mary, accustomed to the trappings of royal privilege and buoyed by the quiet support of devout Catholic noble families, seized the opportunity to marshal her own advocates. She dispatched discreet dispatches to the lords of East Anglia, Suffolk, Norfolk, and their kin, reminding them of Henry VIII's Act of Succession, which indisputably named her as the rightful heir. In these missives, Mary appealed to both tradition and legality, exhorting her allies to stand firm against what she cast as a contrivance of a dying boy and his conspiratorial protectors. By the third dawn after Edward's death, proclamations announcing Lady Jane Grey's queenship fluttered from every cartographer's stall and dust-coated cobblestone. Town criers in pompous robes and gilded chains read the royal edict at Market Cross and Ludgate, their voices echoing off timbered houses and stone merchants' stalls. Meanwhile, Jane, scarcely 16 and accustomed only to the gentle kindness of her upbringing, was hurriedly conveyed to the Tower of London beneath a canopy of velvet. There, within its ancient walls, her supporters arranged a rigorous schedule of rehearsals. Northumberland's advisers coached her through the formal speech she would deliver at the coronation, guiding her posture, her pauses, and the tone deemed suitably regal. They staged mock ceremonies in the White Hall, complete with simulated processions and pipers in motley, ensuring that every gesture, right hand raised in blessing, left hand resting upon the illuminated Bible, would reflect the solemn gravity of a monarch's first appearance. The music masters, too, were employed to select scriptural chants appropriate to a Protestant queen, training choirs to intone "All Hail Queen Jane" in measured harmony. As these preparations reached their fevered height in the Tower's great hall, Mary's faction remained far from idle. In Suffolk's countryside manors, Catholic nobles covertly convened beneath candlelit rafters, forging alliances with merchants chafing under the prospect of unborn inheritance statutes that threatened to strip them of lands and incomes. They exchanged letters sealed with the fleur-de-lis and the 5 wounds of Christ, pledging loyalty not to Jane but to Mary Tudor, the true sovereign, they wrote, by blood and by law. These clandestine correspondences, carried by trusted riders through winding lanes and over pitch-black moors, spoke of forming militias at dawn, mustering armed retainers in every village green, and mustering moral outrage against what they termed Edward's unnatural contrivance. In London's taverns, whispers of rebellion fluttered like restless birds. Will the common people rise for Mary? Will Northumberland's soldiers stand against Yorkists who still cling to Papist sympathies? Such questions, muttered beneath breath and exchanged with furtive glances, made the city's backbone tremble. Thus, as Jane rehearsed her first sovereign stride beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Tower Chapel, and as Mary marshalled her shadowy network in the eastern shires, England found itself on the cusp of civil convulsion. The meticulously prepared legal instruments bore witness to Edward's final will, yet they stood in stark opposition to centuries-old statutes that had enshrined the princesses of Henry's earlier marriages as rightful heirs. At every manor and market cross, arguments flew between adherents of tradition and champions of reformation, each side confident of divine favour. And so, within the silent corridors of Whitehall and the candle-lit rooms of East Anglia, a nation waited balanced precariously between the letter of a fragile, dying king's testament and the weight of age-old laws and loyalties. When the trumpets of coronation sounded at dawn, they would herald not only a queen, but the opening notes of a power struggle that would echo through England's hills and valleys for generations to come. On the 10th day of July, in the year 1553, scarcely 4 days after the passing of Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England within the austere walls of the Tower of London. The ceremony was brief and devoid of the usual pageantry. No throngs of nobles thronging the cathedral, no pealing organ filling the vaulted nave. Instead, a handful of councillors and clerics gathered beneath flickering lanterns to present Jane with the crown of light gold, a circlet whose weight seemed almost too heavy for her slender head. The legality of this accession rested entirely upon the will of Edward and the power of the Duke of Northumberland, whose hand guided every motion of the script. Northumberland stood at the forefront, his cloak of dark velvet billowing as he pronounced the words that bound Jane to the throne. "By virtue of the devise of our late sovereign, and by my authority as Lord Protector, I declare Lady Jane Grey, Queen of England and Ireland." Meanwhile, far to the east in Suffolk and Norfolk, Princess Mary Tudor raised her standard beneath the summer sky. In towns and villages across East Anglia, she was greeted by clergy and commoners alike, both steadfast Catholics and those Protestants still loyal to the principle of hereditary succession. They flocked to her banners bearing the Tudor rose, crying, "God save Mary Tudor!" as she marched toward London with a force of several thousand men, a motley army of gentry retainers, yeoman archers, and townsfolk wielding pikes. Word of her gathering strength spread swiftly along the roadways, carried by riders dispatched to neighbouring shires. In every inn and cottage, villagers whispered hope. Mary is true heir. Jane is but an interloper. Back in the capital, Northumberland swiftly counselled for a military response. He ordered detachments of the London militia and Royal Guard to intercept Mary's advance, stationing pikemen at strategic bridges and deploying cavalry patrols along the main highways. Yet the Protector's preparations faltered in the face of divided loyalty. Many soldiers, hearing of their orders to suppress the daughter of the late king, hesitated to draw steel against a princess they had previously sworn to protect. Some units even slipped away, deserting their posts at the onset of confrontation. Northumberland found himself hampered by this reluctance. Without unified command, his forces could scarcely challenge Mary's swelling ranks. As Northumberland scrambled to muster troops, Mary's procession reached the outskirts of London. Banners fluttered in the breeze as she rode in an open litter, her attendants scattering coins to the cheering crowd. At Temple Bar, the gates opened before her, and the city's officials fell in line behind her cause. The Privy Council, called together in urgent convocation, watched as increasing numbers of aldermen and sheriffs proclaimed allegiance to the true heir. By the second day of her approach, Mary stood before Whitehall's gates beneath a canopy of scarlet, the cry of "Long live Queen Mary!" echoing off stone walls. The Lord Mayor and aldermen kneeled, pressing forward her coronation ring and sceptre, sealing her claim in the sight of God and man. In the midst of this shift, Northumberland was summoned to a final session of the Privy Council. There, amid stifled gasps and shifting chairs, he found himself accused of treason against the realm he once governed in Edward's name. Before he could utter a plea, he was seized by the Tower's yeoman warders and brought swiftly to trial. Within weeks, the Duke, once the most powerful man in England, stood condemned, his ambitions dissolved in the harsh light of justice. He was beheaded on Tower Hill in August of 1553, his final moments marked by the clang of the executioner's sword. Lady Jane Grey, innocence shining in her youthful eyes, fared no better. Though many in London regarded her as a pawn, she was nonetheless charged with high treason for accepting the crown. Shorn of the power that had briefly adorned her, she was confined once more within the Tower's cold stone courts. For months she endured interrogation and the loneliness of confinement, her only company, the distant toll of funeral bells and the muted prayers of sympathetic servants. Then, in the cruel dawn of February 1554, Jane was led to the scaffold, her steps echoing upon the wooden platform as a silent multitude watched. She knelt with grace, offering a final prayer for the realm she had so briefly ruled, before the stroke of the axe brought her tragic reign to its end. Thus concluded the fleeting chapter of the 9-Day Queen. In its wake lay a nation shaken by rapid turns of fortune, where the dictates of a dying boy king and the machinations of a powerful protector had been swiftly undone by the steadfast loyalty to lawful succession. As London returned to relative calm under Queen Mary, the memory of Jane's sorrowful rise and fall endured as a cautionary tale of ambition and devotion, a fragile blossom crushed by the winds of dynastic change. Upon her accession in July of 1553, Queen Mary Tudor moved swiftly and resolutely to reverse the Protestant reforms of her half-brother's reign. Within days, she issued proclamations restoring the Latin Mass to every parish church, recalling into office the displaced Catholic bishops and abbots. The vaulted naves that had echoed with English prayers and sermons were once more filled with Gregorian chant and incense smoke rising like pale mist. Across the kingdom, Church doors that had borne plain crosses now displayed intricately carved altarpieces depicting the Passion of Christ. Statues of saints once hidden or smashed by iconoclasts were reinstalled in niches, their marble faces glimmering under torchlight. Mary viewed these restorations as necessary acts of piety and unity, believing that the only path to stability lay in the universal obedience to Rome. But her zeal did not stop at mere liturgical change. Mary convened special commissions, courts of well-ordered inquisition, as they came to be known to try those steadfast Protestants who refused to recant. Among the first accused was the venerable Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, once Mary's tutor in matters of faith. He was brought before a council of judges in London, the air thick with the scent of rosin and damp woolen gowns. Though pressed to abjure his previous stance, Cranmer stood firm until the flames themselves consumed his defiance. In fields beyond the city walls, prisoners were bound to stakes and strangled by ropes before the wood beneath them was set alight. The crackle and roar of burning timbers echoed through the streets, drawing solemn crowds who watched in horror as ministers of the new faith perished in searing flames. Such spectacles, intended as deterrent, only fostered whispers of Mary as Bloody Mary, a sovereign whose reign was drenched in suffering. Meanwhile, every church that had been adapted for the vernacular Eucharist was returned to its former glory. Font covers were replaced, and daisies of gilding were reapplied to pulpits. Sacred vessels, chalices, patens and censers long hidden in private chapels were dusted off and blessed anew. Choirs in Westminster Abbey sang once more in unison to papal hymns, their voices rising to the rafters as though weaving a tapestry of old devotion. Mary herself wrote to the Pope, beseeching his pardon for England's past transgressions and urging him to restore the authority of the Holy See. She believed, with quiet certainty, that only by reaffirming the Church of Rome could the realm find a firm foundation for both social order and spiritual unity. Yet the Queen's fervent retribution wrought not only spiritual realignment, but also economic upheaval. Landed gentry who had acquired former monastic estates under the dissolution found themselves stripped of property, their deeds declared invalid by royal decree. Vast tracts of arable land and timber fell once more to ecclesiastical hands, fueling the coffers of the restored abbeys and convents. Protestant families, including long-established merchants and nobles, saw their fortunes reversed overnight. Some fled into exile, journeying by clandestine routes through the Low Countries and German principalities where sympathetic rulers offered sanctuary. These émigrés carried with them letters of protest and accounts of Mary's persecutions, planting the seeds of international condemnation. Even as Mary strove to consolidate her rule through acts of mercy toward Catholic loyalists, the tide of enmity grew beyond her control. Heavily burdened by war reparations and the expensive campaigns against Scotland, the Crown found its revenues squeezed by the cost of re-establishing a vast church bureaucracy. Markets felt the strain as prices rose on wheat and wool, goods that had once enriched Protestant traders now diverted to monasteries and cathedrals. Urban labourers, witnessing the spectacle of confessions coerced and clergy executed, muttered discontent in merchant taverns. A growing chorus of dissent, muffled though it was, echoed through streets and hamlets alike. Has our realm traded one tyranny for another? Despite her earnest efforts, Mary's reputation as a merciless enforcer of religious conformity proved indelible. Foreign ambassadors, some aghast, others secretly relieved, recorded her reign as one of unyielding severity. Even within her own council, voices of caution emerged, warning that vengeance might sow the seeds of lasting division. Yet Mary, convinced that she acted as God's instrument to right the realm's soul, remained undeterred. Her final acts before her death included a proclamation of universal penance and a plea for divine mercy upon her people, an acknowledgement perhaps of the sorrow her measures had wrought. In the end, Mary's restoration of Catholicism stood as a testament to her unwavering conviction, but it also became a chapter marked by fear and exile. The Protestant heritage advanced by Edward VI appeared all but erased, its symbols trampled in the glow of burning stakes. Yet the embers of reform survived in the hearts of those who fled, carrying their faith across the sea, ready to kindle new movements in distant lands. Though Mary Tudor sought to bind England to Rome with iron decrees and fire, her reign came to be remembered above all for the price paid in blood forever, etching her legacy with the chilling epithet, Bloody Mary. When Mary Tudor's brief, tumultuous reign came to its quiet close in November of 1558, England found itself weary of religious strife and eager for stability. Into this realm stepped Elizabeth I, half-sister to Edward VI, whose youthful fervour had both kindled and consumed Protestant zeal. From the moment she ascended the throne, Elizabeth moved with measured grace to restore, yet temper, the reforms of her brother's era. Within months, she convened Parliament to pass the Act of Uniformity in 1559, a statute that mandated the use of the English Book of Common Prayer while permitting a range of theological expression. Latin rites remained out of favour, but the lofty austerity of Edward's regime gave way to a service that balanced solemnity with accessibility, forging a path between extremes. Under this Elizabethan settlement, the Church of England emerged as a hybrid institution. Its liturgy sung in the vernacular, its bishops sworn to uphold the monarch's supremacy, yet decorated with the ceremonial hues that echoed older Catholic traditions. Parishioners who had once bristled at the stark simplicity of Edward's chapel now found themselves comforted by the restored beauty of vestments and incense, without fearing the return of papal authority. The Queen herself attended services at St. Paul's Cathedral in carefully embroidered gowns, listening attentively to sermons preached in measured tones that emphasized moral uplift rather than doctrinal fire. Many historians argue that it was precisely the uncompromising reforms of Edward VI that paved the way for Elizabeth's more balanced approach. In Edward's short reign, the removal of altar rails and smashing of icons had signified a break with Rome so radical that any retreat would have seemed a betrayal. Elizabeth understood this legacy. She preserved the core tenets of Protestant doctrine scripture in English, the denial of transubstantiation, the rejection of papal infallibility while reintroducing enough ceremony to placate those who yearned for continuity. Thus did she craft a middle way that has come to be known as the Elizabethan settlement, one that endured for centuries as the foundation of Anglican identity. Edward VI's memory lived on in more than statutes and sermons. Chronicles by Edward Hall and John Fox, penned in the tumult of those years, depicted the boy king as both an iron-hearted youth and a beacon of reform. Fox's acts and monuments, even as it mourned the martyrs of Mary's burnings, extolled Edward's zeal for the gospel, preserving stories of his precocious debates and his final devise for the succession. Hall's History of England likewise praised the late sovereign's commitment to a pure church, while lamenting his untimely passing. Through these works, Edward became a symbol, a monarch whose visions burned brightly, if briefly, and whose influence beckoned future generations to continue the work he had begun. Yet Edward's reign remained a haunting what-if in the annals of English history. Had he lived to adulthood, had his lungs not betrayed him at 15, could England have endured a far more radical Protestant transformation? Would the social fabric have frayed under the demands of even stricter reforms? Or would a fully mature Edward have tempered his own zeal? These questions lingered in scholarly debates, and in the imaginations of poets and playwrights, who portrayed Edward as a tragic figure, destined for greatness, yet undone by the very convictions he held most dear. In the decades that followed, Elizabeth's policy of moderation gradually bore fruit. Under her long reign, England avoided the internecine conflicts that ripped apart other nations torn between Catholic and Reformed camps. The Church of England grew into a cohesive body, whose breadth embracing both elaborate choral services and plain prayers reflected the diverse loyalties of its members. In this, the legacy of Edward VI proved indispensable. His radical break with Rome had cleared the ground for a state church that could survive both internal dissent and external threats. Thus, while Mary's fierce retribution seemed to obliterate Edward's memory and Jane Grey's brief spark flickered and died, it was Elizabeth's via media that enshrined his work in enduring form. The young king's radical zeal had served as both a catalyst and a caution. It compelled reformers to go further, but it also taught his sister the necessity of balance. In the hush of twilight services beneath stained-glass windows, one could still sense the echo of Edward's ambition to shape a realm guided by conscience and scripture. And in the bright mornings of Elizabeth's domain, the faithful bowed their heads in thanks that the kingdom had survived its trials, carrying forward the dual heritage of Puritan rigour and measured ceremony. Edward VI remains, to this day, a poignant testament to the interplay of power, faith, and legacy. Though his reign spanned but 6 years, its imprint on England's religious landscape was profound. His story of youthful conviction, tragic demise, and posthumous influence reminds us that even the briefest light can illuminate a path for generations to come, guiding a nation through darkness toward a future neither wholly new nor entirely rooted in the past. And so our journey through the life and legacy of Edward VI gently comes to rest, like soft ripples settling on a still pond under the silver glow of the moon. As the shadows of history lengthen and the noise of upheaval fades into the quiet hum of memory, we find ourselves cradled in the gentle embrace of reflection. No longer do we hear the clang of steel upon the tower's ramparts, nor the crackle of flames in grim public squares. Instead, we breathe in the hushed cadence of time's passage, each exhalation a tranquil sigh that carries away the cares of courts and councils. In these final moments, let your mind drift among the petals of remembrance. Envision the tender swirl of incense in Westminster's vaulted nave, the soft murmur of prayers in a half-empty chapel, and the light touch of a king's own hand sealing a testament of faith and hope. Feel the cool stone beneath your fingertips as you lean against the ancient walls of history, warm with the echoes of devoted voices and cautious compromises. Allow the flicker of candlelight in distant chapels to lull your thoughts into a calm reverie, where every gentle heartbeat reminds you of the enduring power of belief and the fragile beauty of human aspiration. What, then, is the message carried on the breeze of Edward's brief but luminous reign? It is this: that even the gentlest soul, touched by purpose and guided by conviction, can shape the course of a nation. When youth and wisdom meet in humble service to a greater cause, they plant seeds that may bloom long after their planter has gone. In his fervent devotion to a vision of unity and renewal, Edward teaches us that change, though often turbulent, need not be cruel, and that even in the face of sorrow and uncertainty, one can choose compassion over cruelty, balance over zealotry. His story reminds us that legacies are not forged in strength alone, but in the quiet moments of moral courage and the tenderness with which we carry one another through trials. As the final candle flickers low, and the last strains of our tale drift into silence, let your mind settle into a soft lullaby of peace. Feel the gentle pulse of history's heartbeat slow in harmony with your own, and let the weight of the day gently dissolve into starlit calm. May the values of courage, faith, and temperate grace that guided Edward's fleeting rule inspire your dreams tonight. Rest now, dear listener, in the reassuring warmth of remembrance and hope. Good night and sweet dreams. If you enjoyed this journey through Tudor echoes, do subscribe for more whispered tales and gentle histories, ensuring that you never miss our next serene voyage into the past.